and their current cap is not so far off of their illustrated rate back in 2012, 2013, 2014. So long story short, I think my guess is they probably performed pretty well. Have they performed better than illustrated? No, that's more a reflection of the old illustrated rates. And then I think going forward over the next 10 years, the problem is going to be low caps. And then, obviously potentially poor equity performance. I do think now with AG49, AG49A, there's probably a better chance than there was before, but I still think that you could potentially do this challenge in 10 years with the policies being sold today, especially all the ones with the engineered indexes and all that sort of stuff, and still save your $1,000.
Hey, what's going on, cash flow hackers? It's Chris with Life 180, and I am back with one of my favorite people in the business, Bobby Samuelson from Life Product Review. I talk about his blog, his channel, his page all the time because I personally reference it as a huge source for me in my education, my trying to keep up into the business. Bobby, I don't know how you do it, but somehow you are able to stay on top of things like nobody else I know. And so I'm just excited to have you back on here and talk about the current state of the insurance business, the index universal life space, the whole life space. And, we just talked before we went live a little bit about the IUL challenge. So I guess that might be kind of a fun place to start because, so just so for everybody who's maybe seeing this for the first time, I created an IUL challenge because of the fact that I see people sending me illustrations all the time, and people sending me kind of like their in-force illustrations or their policy statements and saying, Chris, what the heck is going on with my stuff? And I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is atrocious, right? And so what happens is I was like, okay, how do we start getting a different conversation going around this? Because most of the people selling IUL, from my experience, especially like the influencers on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, nobody's been doing it long enough to really know from a long-term perspective how these things are going to play out, right? And so I was like, well, from a long-term perspective, and you can speak to this better than I can, my perspective is the performance of the policy is not going to perform as it was illustrated, right? And it doesn't mean it's a horrible product, by the way, because of that. It just means it's sold, it's misrepresented, and it's missold. And when that is the case and expectations are out of alignment with reality, that is what can hurt people, right? And so that's kind of my perspective. And my opinion is, when you look at the performance of it and you compare an IUL, what it's really going to do long-term, and then the risks that you're still taking to get there potentially versus like a whole life, to me, I personally would choose whole life every single time. That's just my take. And that's why I do what I do. So I created this IUL challenge, basically saying the first person that can show me a policy that's out of surrender period, so 10 years to 15 years, depending on the thing, that I need the original submitted illustration, and I need an in-force illustration, and the in-force illustration has to at least match. I don't need it to blow it away by 20%, which, by the way, is what I should do if you want to like do what the agents are saying it would do, according to the fact that the markets have been on the greatest bull run of all time in the last 10 years. But so I just say, hey, just match it for me. I probably could say, hey, just get within 20% or something like that. And I could probably still, get away with it. But that is the challenge. If they can show a current in-force illustration with the original submitted and it matches, I'll give somebody $1,000. I've had 100,000 views. I realize not all those views are agents. But 100,000 views on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube on the videos with hashtag IUL challenge. Go check it out. And not one person has been able to do it. I've had a couple people tell me, hey, give me like 4 more years and mine's on track and it'll get there. Like, you should shorten the time frame, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, the time frame is what it is for a reason, like because of how they kind of manipulate these things. So you're even more knowledgeable than I am on the IUL side. I learn a lot about this stuff from you, right? And so can you kind of maybe give your opinion and deep dive why this is the case? And for full transparency, Bobby didn't know about the IUL challenge until 10 minutes ago, right?
Yeah, it was actually kind of funny listening to you describe it. I'm thinking like, all right, now why wouldn't this work? So so there's a couple of things that you're doing that I think stack the deck in your favor. All right, one is it's got to be out of surrender charge period. And so I was looking, 2022. All right, so that's 2012. IUL market was pretty small in 2012. A lot of those products back then, though, were 15-year products. So now we got to go all the way back to 2007.
Okay.
There's just not a lot of IUL out there in 2007. So,
well, in fairness, just so you know, I didn't say at a surrender in the challenge. It's 10 years old or more.
Okay, 10-year old or more. All right.
And I'm just assuming it's going to be at a surrender period.
Yeah, but I think you're picking up on something there, which is really important, which is people who are selling this stuff, like you said, don't actually have the long-term history. All right. So, but now, why aren't you getting more submissions? I think a lot of it comes back to, 2012 was pre-AG 49, and it was kind of the wild, wild west back then. So, it was not uncommon to see 8 to 9% illustrated rates back then. So what I'm guessing is actually a lot of IULs probably have performed in the 7 to 8% range in the greatest bull run in his, as you mentioned.
Yep.
But the problem is not so much the performance. I think the performance has actually probably been okay. It's, to your point, it's the really aggressive illustrated rates that were used back then. Now the question is, all right, so what about the next 10 years? And I think that's where it kind of gets interesting, because you go, all right, so a policy sold today, what if you did an IUL challenge in 10 years? How would it look? And I think the issue now is for those older products is caps are way lower than where they were before. So, there are situations where, there's a product I have in mind right now that the cap is currently lower. The cap is lower than the illustrated rate for that product in 2007 by 1.5%. So the illustrated rate in 2007 was around 9.5%. The current cap is 8%.
Oh.
So it's physically impossible for that. Now again, that's kind of an edge case, but actually, and you know what? Actually, I'm thinking of another carrier. I'm thinking of the number one selling IUL carrier for years, and their current cap is not so far off of their illustrated rate back in 2012, 2013, 2014. So long story short, I think my guess is they probably performed pretty well. Have they performed better than illustrated? No, that's more a reflection of the old illustrated rates. And then I think going forward over the next 10 years, the problem is going to be low caps. And then, obviously potentially poor equity performance. I do think now with AG 49, AG 49A, there's probably a better chance than there was before, but I still think that you could potentially do this challenge in 10 years with the policies being sold today, especially all the ones with the engineered indexes and all that sort of stuff, and still save your $1,000. Now you could also go bankrupt. I'm not gonna, but it's possible that they perform really well. But I think you're picking up on a few key macro trends that are really important. And again, but the main one I go back to is, look, there are people out there selling IUL and talking about historical performance, and they don't actually have any real history to go off of. The carriers generally don't publish this stuff. Some of them have, but it's not kind of widely known. So yeah, I think you're onto something with your challenge here. And I think you'll lose $1,000. I definitely think you'll lose $1,000. I think somebody somewhere illustrated it conservatively enough back in 2012 to get the $1,000 out of you. Some responsible agent illustrated it at 4%, and they beat it, and they're going to send you ready to lose $1,000.
And I said in my video, and you can go watch it when you have time, but like when I did the challenge video, the original challenge video, I said I fully anticipate I'm going to give somebody $1,000 at some point in time here, right? Like I'm not saying it's not possible. Yeah. I'm just trying to create the conversation around expectations, misrepresentation, all this stuff. And by the way, and part of the challenge is if you are that agent where I have to give you $1,000, I'm also going to bring them on the channel and tell everybody this is a good agent, right? Like, because if you're illustrating things and you get the expectations in alignment and you're, doing it the right way, you deserve to be, paraded. Like
now let me play critic, right? I'm going to play your hater. I'm going to play your troll real quick.
Do. I got a lot
which is show me a whole life illustration that has.
Okay, so I've gotten that question about 1,000 times already, as you can imagine.
All right, lay it on me. What do you say?
So the answer is like, listen, I don't dispute that. We've been living in a declining interest rate environment, and so that puts stress on the general funds of the life insurance, general account. And so therefore dividend rates have had to come down. So yes, dividends have come down for whole life policies. They've underperformed. But if you compare the two, they're sold completely differently, right? So
they are.
So when I look at it that way, not only that, I look at it and I've also kind of kept the conversation going, and I'd actually be curious of your feedback on this. But I've said, okay, kind of what you were speaking to at the beginning, what's the next 10 years look like, right?
Yeah.
Like I can look at an illustration and I don't have a crystal ball, right? Like nobody knows the future, no guarantees of anything happening one way or the other. But
Yep.
I can look at a whole life illustration for a company with like a 5.2% dividend. And I can look at the 10-year rates and go like, if I'm buying this, I actually believe I'm probably going to outperform this, right? Because I think rates are going up, dividend scales are going to come back. Whereas if I look at an IUL, a lot of the agents are going, well, if the general fund goes up, they're going to just raise caps. Well, it's not that clean because they may increase their options budget, but the options costs, the hedging costs, like all these different things. There's so many more variables that come into play for the success of an IUL. Whereas a whole life policy, it's so transparent, so straightforward. Like what you see is what you get. You're partnering with the company, the general fund. Like, so can you give some feedback as to my take on that?
I think it's a very fair argument. And I think that is the piece that people forget. They forget that part of the problem with IUL has been interest rates going down for sure. And that's lowered caps, same effect that you see in dividends.
Mm-hmm.
But you made a point earlier that I think is a key point, which is yes, but at the same time, we had the perfect gangbuster return decade for IUL. So in a lot of ways, the last decade has been the perfect time. I called it the honeymoon decade in an article one time because everything went perfectly. And because option prices fell as interest rates fell. And yes, portfolio yields came down, but not as quickly as rates came down, which means caps went up. Mm-hmm. And we had crazy, incredible equity returns all at the same time. So everything sort of went right for IUL in the last decade. And whole life just kind of, was lower interest rates flow through to the dividend, although there's some noise in there. But in general, that's true.
Yeah.
I think if you kind of go forward the next decade, you really have to ask the question, all right, in a rising rate environment, what happens? Well, we know portfolio rates are going to lag. So we know dividend interest rates are going to lag. The degree to which they lag is kind of up for grabs. And by the way, I don't view that as a problem for whole life.
No.
I view that as a messaging story. Like, okay, so what's the alternative? You go put money in bonds. Great. Rising interest rates lower the value of the bond.
Sure.
In a whole life policy, you don't have that effect. There's no mark-to-market accounting going on.
Yep.
But at the same time, in IUL, like option prices are going to get more expensive, and they have been getting more expensive recently. Over the last, really since 2014, kind of consistently becoming more expensive.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem for IUL because not only is the portfolio yield lagging, but now you also have this pressure from rising rates. So I think you're kind of framing it up the right way. But I do think if I was an IUL guy and I said, great, I've got a whole life challenge, I don't think I'd lose my $1,000 either. And so I think we just kind of have to be, I think the big thing too is like, look, and this is a big problem in the industry. Mm-hmm. People mistake an illustration to be a projection.
Totally.
It is 100%. Not a projection. And I think that's what IUL falls into that trap way more than whole life. And I think good whole life sellers sell the product as a structure, and then they sell the company and the participating dividend. The illustration shouldn't be even part of the sale. But in IUL, I just find people really use the illustration as the proof. They use it as the proof for the sale. And that is not the way illustrations were intended. That's not the way the regulations are written. That's not what regulators had in mind when they created the rules around this stuff. And so that, I think, is the challenge. And I also think, it's kind of the interesting thing going on in the industry right now. There's a lot more talk right now about illustration model regulation revisions. And what that means is, we could see illustrations fundamentally change because the law could change. We imagine a world where instead of showing an illustration that shows out the next 50 years, all you had is a 1-year snapshot. And then you have like a schedule of policy charges.
Would that be for IUL?
Just imagine for any product. Well, so you'd see the guarantees, and then you'd see the current schedule if applicable.
Yeah.
Whole life, you could still sell whole life. That's how my granddad sold whole life back in the 60s, right? He had a rate book, and then he told the story that did it. So we know that works for whole life.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that would annihilate the IUL market like overnight, which is a tragedy because you should be able to sell IUL without an illustration. IUL is a great story conceptually. Mm-hmm. Where we run into problems is when we use the illustration as a tool. So I think that's what your illustration challenge, now that I'm thinking about it, because you did just drop this on me, is really kind of getting to, is it's more like, stop using illustrations to sell life insurance.
Totally. So
that is.
Yeah, 100%. And with that said, I would say this is like, if you think about like what role does life insurance play in your personal finances? I look at it like this: life insurance do one thing better than any other company in the financial industry, and that is preserving the purchasing power of your money, period.
Yeah,
right.
Totally. It's a great way to put it.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that is their number one thing. So to think like this is what life insurance companies have done, let's call it for 200 years. It's a little less than that probably, but like, let's just call it 200 years. That's what they've done. And that's what's been proven. That's what has a track record that can't be beaten. Right. And so when you look at it from that perspective and we're saying, okay, this is what they do. They never go get big returns. That's not what they do. Right. And so
not the deal.
Like, why now all of a sudden are we going to shift when this IUL is created to, and somehow take this 200-year track record of history and say, okay, they're going to be able to do that for you? Because my mindset is like, if they could do that for you, they'd be doing it for themselves.
Well, all right. So let's have a little history lesson. I agree with you, but I do think the industry has always kind of flirted with this fine line of, all right, what do we do really well? To your point, we preserve. I put these three things in all my presentations: protects families, preserves capital, provides stability.
Love it.
That's what we do. We protect families, preserve capital, provide stability. That is what life insurance is better than anything else at doing. Full stop, end of story. But I do think we go through these cycles of life insurance trying to be something it's not. And I think IUL is that. We had Stoli before that. I don't know if your listeners know about Stoli, stranger-owned life insurance. Do you know about Stoli? Have you heard of Stoli?
No, I don't.
Oh,
it's weird.
Chris, this is like, so when I got into business, the story was, you got a gardener in California with a net worth of $30, and some agent shows up and says, hey, I'll pay you 50 grand if you sign this life insurance application and claim that you're worth $10 million. So I can buy a life insurance policy on you. And then I'm going to go sell that to investors.
That's insane.
I mean, it is insane, but that was again, life insurance being something that it's not. Okay. And then before that, we had vanishing premium whole life. We had VUL. Yeah. In fact, if you stretch it all, one of the best books I've ever read on life insurance stretches all the way back in the late 1800s. And we had these companies that would do basically tontine dividends inside of their whole life policies. And that was the whole reason why we had the Armstrong Commission in 1905 that precipitated the sort of regulation of life insurance. So I think our history as an industry is always this. I don't think it's just IUL. I think it's always this tension of, we protect families, preserve capital, provide stability. It's kind of a noble mission of our industry.
Yep.
And then this like kind of freakish sort of, life insurance as really an investment vehicle, or life insurance can, provide these returns that nobody. No, that is not what this was ever meant to be. And usually these are these sorts of pitches for life insurance are sort of temporary phenomenon. Yeah. Because of market dislocations that are misrepresented to clients as permanent. And I think that's what vanishing premium was. That's what VUL illustrated at 12% was. That's what Stoli was. And in a lot of ways, that's what IUL illustrated, is these little things. The thing I always say to people, like you said, if it was so great, why don't insurance companies do it for themselves? Okay, let me ask it a different way. If this was really the best idea in the world, why isn't Wall Street doing this? Yeah. Why is Wall Street actually pursuing the opposite strategy when it comes to how they use options? They sell options. We buy options. Do we really think that a bunch of small Midwestern life insurance companies figured out an investment strategy that no one else in the world, like this does not, I heard this great quote one time. Well, anyway, my view is like, if you want to ferret out a story, don't go dig into the details. Go think about it at a high level and go like Theranos, where I first heard that quote was in conjunction with Theranos. Like how the guy who busted the Theranos story said, it just didn't make any sense at a high level. How could a Stanford dropout with no medical experience reinvent the blood testing market? Well, she didn't. She was a fraud. Yep. How is it that a small Midwestern life insurance company who doesn't really know anything about investments could come up with an investment that supposedly beats everything Wall Street could offer? Yep. It probably doesn't. It's not that complicated. It's common sense. So anyway.
Common sense goes a long ways. But Brendan Burchard, who is somebody I follow, I don't know if you know who he is, but he says common sense is very seldom common practice. Right.
That's well said.
That's just where we are. Right. So okay, I'm gonna take a left turn on you right now, because as you were talking about all that, obviously I do a lot of content on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all that stuff, right? And so one of the things, and I gotta say this, TikTok, man, has been like the biggest war pole for me. I don't know. Are you on TikTok?
Look, man, as a millennial, I don't do any social media, so I'm one of those guys. But I know, I've heard of the TikToks. Okay, I've heard of the TikTok. I don't know much about it though. Okay, and I know there's a lot of IUL stuff on TikTok, because I get people have texted me videos.
Bro, it's a travesty. It's a travesty. like what's going on TikTok
So what's
right
going
now
on?
as far as the video. So I want to ask you this, like, because I saw a video yesterday and a guy was saying, and it's a guy that I like. That was the sad part. It's a guy that I like. And he was doing this thing and he's like, have you heard of the 4% rule? Well, let me show you how to turn the 4% rule into an 8% rule. And so if you have a pile of money sitting in a 401k, you're only going to be able to safely take out 4%. But if you put it into an IUL, we could do 8% safely, and you're going to be able to double your income, reduce your risk, all this stuff. Fire back for me.
And you're crazy. What are you talking about? Why would you even remotely think that could work? But let's go through the math here. Why does it work on the illustration? The reason why it works on the illustration is because it assumes you can borrow money from the policy at a lower cost. Borrow money from the policy, and yet the assets in the policy grow at a faster rate than the cost of the loan. So it's permanent arbitrage is what fuels that 8% withdrawal rate. If you take away that assumption and you assume more reasonable returns, which is what the 4% rule is kind of designed to assume, and you assume no arbitrage, you can't even get 4% out of a life insurance policy. So, it's the assumptions underneath that 8% that are just, they're completely unreasonable. They would exist nowhere else in the financial world. I'll tell you a quick funny story about this. I had a similar conversation with the chief investment officer for a pretty major mutual fund complex here in Charlotte. And this mutual fund complex does a lot of stuff in derivatives. And I was telling him about IUL, and I was talking about how IULs are illustrated, basically saying like, it's this perpetual assumed arbitrage. And we're eating sushi and he starts to laugh. And I, what are you laughing at? He goes, I was just thinking that if I put that in some of our market, then I would get arrested and sent to jail. Is that happens all the time in insurance. And I'm like, yeah. And I think this 8%, I hate to say it, but I think that's that line of thinking is, oh yeah, it's 8%. Well, why? Oh, because of all these assumptions that like no other financial product in any other respect could possibly make, except in this fixed insurance product we call IUL. Now, by the way, this is not just an IUL problem. Right. There are non-direct recognition whole life products where people assume perpetual arbitrage between the loan interest rate and the dividend rate. And by the way, there may be some reasons to believe that that's true because of outside business earnings and some other stuff that, again, does not exist in IUL, but does exist in the whole life. But let's just say for a second, we're going to follow the Northwestern Mutual rule here and say that does not exist because they don't illustrate that. You're never going to get 8% out of those products. You're going to get a whole lot less. And so I think that's that's my reaction to that is like, that's someone saying, oh, that looks great on the surface. And I'm just not willing to dig one step deeper to ask the tough question. And that's what you have to do in this business. You have to dig one step deeper.
Totally. But from that perspective, that's where like a whole life policy can be a great volatility buffer in retirement, right? Like you need to leverage it and lean on it for a couple of years at a time to help.
Sure.
It'll make, I always use the analogy. So you and I are about the same age, right? Like, so you grew up in the 90s, right?
Yep.
Do you remember, do you remember the BASF commercials? No. So every Sunday when I would watch football, there was these commercials that was on BASF. It would be like, at BASF, we don't make the paint you make that you use. We make it brighter. We don't make the fishing line. We make it stronger. So I think about like whole life as the BASF of the financial business is like, it's not the investment you make. It just makes the investments you make better because it gives you a foundation, a cornerstone asset foundationally that'll allow you to actually behave like a good investor.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the best arguments I've ever heard for whole life is if you have assets in whole life, that'll allow you to take more risk elsewhere. Because you know that you don't. So I think there's real power. This is the wealth building cornerstones kind of mentality. And that's kind of how they think about it. And I think there's some real power, to that. And I would just say IUL doesn't really fit in that bucket. It can fit in a different bucket, but it's not what whole life is. It's not safety. It's not stability. Yes, it has a 0% floor, but it also has policy charges that come out. Whereas whole life, guaranteed cash value growth every year. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And that's the cornerstone element of the product. So I agree. We need to kind of separate these things out a little bit and correctly put them in the right categories of what they really do.
So that said, there's all the marketing. I think one of the biggest probably marketing terms for whole life right now is infinite banking.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm not like the biggest believer in every component that infinite banking is sold on. I think it's misrepresented in a lot of times, kind of in
Yep.
the same light that I would kind of position a lot of IUL agents misrepresenting IUL.
Yep.
However, what's happened now is now you have a lot of people on TikTok and social media saying IUL is just a better way to do infinite banking, and I mean, I see you shaking your head. Like, I see Nelson Nash rolling over in his grave right now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and while I don't agree necessarily with I would agree with like 90 to 95% of infinite banking. It's just like some of the fringe ideas and concepts are a little too much for me. But like, what are your thoughts on infinite banking and IUL?
Infinite banking is one of these terms that I think can be applied to lots of different things. But if we just boil infinite banking down to the way that I think about it, which is it's kind of program agnostic. You have a life insurance policy and you can effectively collateralize the values in the life insurance policy with a loan that effectively costs you nothing. That's just life insurance. I mean, Universal Life has wash loan provisions on it. My VUL policy that I have with TICREF has a wash loan provision. I can use that for infinite banking by borrowing. I mean, that's the core of infinite banking, right? It's just you put the money in, you borrow against it if you want to, you can pay it back. Like it is your source of cash, and it doesn't cost you anything to do that. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's just what life insurance works. The challenge with the reason why whole life works well with infinite banking is because the cash value grows on a guaranteed basis. And so there's a stability to the product where, like, if you have a problem, if you overloan that product and you have a problem, you can see it coming from a million miles away. The problem with using infinite banking for IUL and all of its sort of sub strategies, there are a lot of those floating around, is that, if you get a couple of zeros in a row, you could lapse your policy and end up with a phantom income tax bill. You're not going to get a zero in a whole life policy. So it's not that it wouldn't work in IUL. It's not that the mechanics wouldn't work. It's not that the policy, would preclude that. It's that you're taking a lot more risk when you do it in an IUL, when you use variable loans. Now, if you use fixed loans in IUL, that takes away a lot of the risk, but nobody does that. They all use variable loans.
Yeah.
So if you go in and use variable loans, you're running this huge risk of potentially lapsing your policy, and then you have to pay interest, or you have to pay back some loan or whatever it is to kind of rescue it, and you just aren't going to be able to do that in a whole life policy. You're not taking nearly as much risk. So that is the problem I see with IUL. Is the thing needs to be managed. You got to manage a whole life policy when you're doing infinite banking. You need to manage it pretty well. Yeah. You need to manage it perfectly for IUL, and you need to leave, in my view, a pretty big margin for error, which may make it not look as attractive anyway. So, I'm not a fan of infinite banking and IUL. Unfortunately, I see it all the time. It's not called infinite banking. It's called premium financing, where they pay off the external policy loan with an internal policy loan. It's called LERP. It's called all these other strategies. Again, those can all work, but you got to manage that policy perfectly. And a lot of carriers don't even give agents the tools to do that. We're kind of kicking the can down the road on, like, every IUL policy I see has income illustrated. Very few of those carriers have automated income programs or income management programs. Who's going to manage all this stuff? Same issue with infinite banking.
So what would your advice be to, like, these agents that are looking at IULs and they're selling IULs right now with this expectation that they're going to get 8% for income in retirement? And how would you coach them into, like, digging deeper? What are the 1, 2, or 3 things that you would say that they should look into to realize? Because I think they're doing it under the guise of, like, hey, I'm trying to help people, and they believe what they're doing. They just don't know what they don't know. So, like, how do they focus on educating themselves in the right way to come to a better conclusion to serve their clients better?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Early on in my career, I used to think people had bad intentions, and people still do have bad intentions. But I think most folks selling IUL, first of all, it's a good product. Like, there is nothing wrong with the product. A lot of the ways I see IUL pitched, they pitch it as if IUL is the only one, for example, that has tax advantages.
Yeah.
Every life insurance policy does. They pitch it as the only one that has downside protection. There's a lot of options to get downside protection. So I think some of it is, like, there's a lot of people who come up in the IUL school, and that's all they know. So one thing I'd say to people selling IUL is a great product. It's one of many permanent product options. And I think as an advisor, understanding all the tools that are available to you and where they fit is key. And so don't just think that, oh, I'm selling IUL and IUL is the only tool I can use in this situation. it's probably not. A VUL may be a great, I'm a huge fan of VUL. A VUL may be a great fit. A whole life policy might be a great fit. A term policy might be a great fit. Nobody wants to sell term, but term can be a great fit for a lot of clients. So I'd say first and foremost, just get your head out of IUL and go look at everything. And then the second thing is, think about how you're using that illustration. If you're selling off the illustration and that's your main proof point, your main moment of truth with the client, you're setting yourself up for a real problem. And I think that's true, not just for IUL, that's true for VUL, that's true for whole life, that's true for any life insurance product. The illustration should never be the proof point.
Yep.
So yeah, my advice would be, understand all the products, don't just understand IUL, don't sell off the illustration, and really understand how this product is built. There's nothing magic going on here, guys. All it is just fixed interest rates at the carrier, going to go buy call options that give you index exposure. It's not that complicated, but so much stuff that I hear agents position the clients as sort of this, almost this magic around IUL. It's just options. And so do a little bit of education for yourself, understand how options work. And because really when you sell IUL, you're selling an options package. That is effectively what you're selling. And if you're going to do that, you need to understand what they are and how they work. I know it's a little bit of work. I know it's complicated, but it'll make you, if you choose to keep selling IUL, and a lot of people will and should, if you understand options, you're going to be a much better, you're going to have a much better ability to articulate the value proposition of the product. And you will have far fewer surprises for clients down the road if you can articulate that story up front. Most agents I know can't. So yeah, maybe that's the three things. Know the other products you have available to you. Know a little bit about options. And again, for goodness sakes, do not sell off of the illustration. Challenge yourself. See if you can sell an IUL without even showing an illustration until the very end. Now, when you have the illustration, run it at 4% and see if you can still sell it. If you can't still sell it, then that's a red flag.
Right. And I would say though, it's been really frustrating for me when I read certain books, and I'm not going to name the books, but like the people that focus on the indexing and, never having a down year and it always going up and like selling on that concept. You got to understand all the nuances, all the disclaimers, all the downsides of the product. They sell it as if there's no downside and that you can't lose money to market loss. And I feel like
you can.
That's okay. Please elaborate for.
Yeah, I mean, look, policy charges come out of that product. So, for example, I'm a big fan of fixed index annuities. I know that sounds surprising to some people, but FIAs actually have downside protection because there are no policy charges.
Yeah,
IUL actually does have downside loss potential because every time you go to 0%, your policy charges are coming out, your account value is coming down. An FIA can never lapse because of policy charges because there are no policy charges. So that ratcheting actually works. With an IUL, you really don't ratchet. You kind of ratchet and then you go down by the policy charges. And I think we just got to get real about that. I've seen like email chains with agents to clients saying, well, it's okay, you can never lose money in this product. No, that's not true. In fact, you can show them the schedule of policy charges, and that is exactly how much money they could lose in this contract.
Yeah.
And newsflash, it's more than whatever premium you put into it.
Right.
So yeah, you don't want any surprises on the state. As a good advisor, you don't want any surprises when the client gets their statement. And when the client gets a statement and gets a 0% credit and they see their account value go down, if you told them they can never lose money, you're going to have hell to pay. If you tell them you're never going to get a negative credit, but we're going to have to satisfy these policy charges, so you'll never lose money directly because the market goes down, but you will still have to pay for your charges. Well, now now they understand how it works.
Yeah, it's especially applicable, I feel like, when people are in retirement and they start utilizing the policy loans, right? Because if you're utilizing a variable policy loan, whatever they want to call it based on the company, but if you're using the index loan, right, feature, and you're borrowing money against a policy for income, and then you have down years, more policy charges. They all talk about the power of compounding. One of the things I've been saying a lot lately is compounding can work against you in these things.
Yeah.
Too. And right? Like,
100%.
Yeah. And so like, that's just something I think people need to understand. And it's a lot of times my challenge with this is like, once again, it's not that IULs are bad. It's that expectation management is out of alignment with reality. And the problem is, for most people, they're going to be into this and they're not going to know until it's too late.
That's right. Yeah. And I think fortunately, a lot of IULs, there are remediation steps you can take and still have a good outcome. But
Okay.
again, agents don't cover that with clients up front. They just pretend, oh, nothing will ever go wrong. You'll never have any risk.
Yeah.
I mean, stick around the life insurance. I mean, I'm third generation in the business. My granddad started selling insurance in the 60s. I've heard every horror story there is.
Yeah.
I mean, and the one thing I picked up that's stuck with me through this is a pure fact about our business, is whatever you think is going to happen ain't going to happen.
It is not going to
It's
happen.
just not. The world changes. And
Yeah.
so I don't care what the illustration says. The world is dynamic, and we got to prepare clients for that.
That's
So
right.
yeah, you're doing good work, Chris.
Thank you.
I
man.
mean, this is what it takes to get these conversations out, because carriers want to show up and just say, I got the best illustration, go sell my product.
Totally.
And you got to fight against it. As an advisor, you have to fight against that. You can't just get swept up in it. So
Well, so I'm keeping the IUL challenge going. If you meet anybody, Bobby, just share it with them. Just tell them to search
man.
hashtag IUL challenge. And
if I see an illustration looks better, I'm getting $1,000 off of you. So watch
do it,
out,
bro. Do it. Split it with the agent. Just make it happen, man. Like, I'm all in. Like, let's just do this. Listen, I'm not doing, I want to say this. I didn't create the IUL challenge to be like, hey, look at all you idiots that like you're wrong. Like that wasn't the purpose for this for me. The purpose was to take the conversation to a different level, because I fully anticipate I'm going to have to cut a check for $1,000 to somebody at some point in time. However, for everybody that's saying, oh, these are all these just great products, why are 99.999% of these policies not doing what you say it's going to do?
Yep.
That's
I got a better idea. My subscription to the Life Product Review is $1,000 a year. Why don't you give them a subscription to the Life Product Review instead of giving them cash? It's the gift of a lifetime, Chris. They'll love you for it. It's great.
Totally. Listen,
Wow.
man, I don't know if you've seen a bump. I hope you have in your subscriptions, because I plug your stuff like nobody's business, like on every single video, because like I truly believe, like, if you are an agent in this business, especially an IUL agent, and you're not doing your due diligence of doing your own third-party education, because you're not going to get it from the carriers, you're not going to get it from PHP or WFG. I know you probably can't comment on that, but that's my strong opinion. And like, you're just not going to get it. You got to get it elsewhere. You got to be willing to dive deeper, because if you're in this to serve people and help people reach their financial goals and objectives, it's your job to become an expert and figure out how you can add the most value. And I had somebody on one of my comments yesterday say, well, you know, this company's great because they've paid $1 billion in commissions. So look how amazing it is. I'm like, I couldn't care less how much they're paying if it's on the backs and at the expense of all the clients you're trying to sell. Like,
why even? That's such a bizarre fact.
It's just like, I don't care. You know what I care about? Like, it's like, if that's your focus, that tells me all I need to know about your company.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's made my head explode. So anyway, guys, if you are watching this for the first time, and if you're newer in the industry, if you're experienced, I would say the number one thing, and I'm not saying this lightly, I say this even when I'm not on the call with Bobby here, is like the number one thing I believe you can do is go to his site. I'll link it in the description below, lifeproductreview.com. I get nothing for this. I have no horse in the race. The only thing I have is that I love this business, and I'm scared that a lot of these IUL sales tactics are going to have a real negative consequence from regulators. And I think the spillover into how it negatively impacts whole life insurance is a real potential negative consequence. And so, not that I think I can do anything to necessarily change that, but like, I'm going to do what I can, you know? One last thing before I go, because it just hit me. Is there any opinion or any updates on like a potential new regulation update, like AG 49B or anything of that?
It's just a submission period. Cheryl Moore and I actually teamed up to write a letter in. We thought that'd be impactful, and I think it was. And looks like there's a consistent kind of message from life insurance companies saying, yeah, we think there's a problem that needs to get resolved. So now we're going to find out how we resolve it.
Okay.
So stay tuned.
All right. Yeah. Exciting. Anything
Cool.
else you got? Or
nope. Thanks for the time, man. I always appreciate it. It's always fun conversation.
Appreciate it, man. You're like my favorite person to have on. So
anytime
you want to be here, man, excited to have you.
I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, guys.